and we'll get on with the conversation. So we're here to help the BAS industry get through the pandemic, and more importantly, figure out what's on the other side of all of this for commercial buildings. The panelists for the show are all listed on mondaylive.org. So if you want to see the profiles and things, it's all linked to their respective LinkedIn profiles. Just a reminder that the views here are those of the individual and not of any company or organization. Please do post on Zoom on the Q&A in the chat to make comments or ask questions. And if you could complete the survey at the end of the show, it would be great. We thank you for that. So the agenda for today is that we'll spend 15 minutes on each of these. First, we'll talk about big picture news and trends that sort of caught the eye of the members here, just to talk about them. And then we'll talk about best practices, things that we're observing directly in terms of what we're doing and what other people are doing that's helping, and maybe some that we're learning that are not helping. And then the main part of the show, we're going to be talking about SaaS and managed services as a potential sort of new model for doing business post the pandemic. So I'm just going to scan through some slides that the group have put together. These slides are all available on mondaylive.org. So if you want to see any of these links, please head over there, and you'll see the slide deck on the homepage. A number of items from Ken Sinclair, as normal. He always comes up, gathers an awful lot of stuff. Steve Fay talking about the risk survey. John Petsy, a number of really sort of salient topics for now. Therese talking about big picture stuff as well as SaaS and managed services. Jim Butler's talking about reopening plans at universities. Roger, who's not on the call today, talking about preparedness and other stuff. Mark talking about a couple of links here, looks interesting. And Tracy talking about subscription models that seem to be doing well. And so that's the start of it, and this is the agenda. So let's get down to talking about big picture stuff, and I'll invite anybody to start this conversation. What's in the news? What are we seeing out there that's sort of striking? Anyone want to start?
Well, I'll start since somebody wants to start. I'm involved in this Well-Being Festival and it's kind of an interesting thing. We've been talking about digital mindfulness for quite a while, and I got involved in that a few years ago. And I think now more than ever, this whole digital ethic issue is starting to come up, and I'm kind of interested in being part of that, as well as learning a little bit more. There's some of the software people are speaking at this same conference. I think that'll be interesting. So that's kind of it's interesting how we always used to talk about technology, the bits and bytes and blinking lights, and now we know we're kind of moved off into philosophies and what are the people going to do, and it's because that is going to control our future more than technology.
Sounds like a good topic as we're all using more and more digital technology today. So that's great.
I got to tell you, Ken, bringing that human aspect into this, not at the user level, the customer level, but boy, at the strategic level and going beyond just bits and bytes and taking a little bit more of a human, philosophical, whatever you want to say, approach to it. I think there's a lot of value in that during this transitional time.
I agree. One of the articles that I posted, oh, sorry, John. One of the articles that I posted talks about one of the benefits of recurring revenue models in your business that I found kind of interesting, and that is that it just naturally creates a re-engagement with the customer, with your customer, right? Because you have a a monthly recurring touch point every month. It's not one and done and move on to the next. You have an ongoing relationship with that customer. So that's kind of supportive of what we're talking about today.
Good point.
On the topic of re-engaging with human beings, one of the items I posted was just the recent announcement that NFMT canceled their event for August. I haven't seen it change to a virtual event. It's something we've been tracking because, it's how we reach most of our, opportunities and customers. And we're going to be part of a virtual trade show next week. AEE West is going virtual with more than a Zoom meeting. There's a whole platform for it. So we're really interested to see how that works and how it engages, right? Because I think as busy as we still might be, the one thing that's definitely happening from my point of view is the lack of engagement with people, right? Because you're not seeing them. And as we talk about how these changes might create a new normal, how effective can multi-attendee events be with virtual tools, right? I mean, we can get together and there's a small panel and we have our listeners, but that's not how a trade show works in a conference, right? So I'm really looking forward to that. That's next week for 3 days, and learning about these new platforms, which again are specialized. They're not Zoom, they're not GoToMeeting, they're these other type of platforms.
In fact, to your point, John, I just saw something interesting. I sent Anto's way, I think last week, a new platform called Hopin, Hopin, which was designed exactly for that. It's a virtual conference. It had a stage, it had a meeting rooms, it had sessions, it had collaboration. You could actually do virtual booths. You could set up a virtual booth. It was, brand new out of the box. It looked like they had built it up in the last 6 months or so, but actually quite compelling when I looked at it.
Yeah.
Can you post that link, Anna?
Yeah. Let me track it in.
Yeah, I took a look at it after Anna sent it to me, and it looked pretty interesting. And I spent quite a bit of time in my life, obviously, organizing conferences, and this shift to trying to do virtual conferences could be quite interesting and could be quite influential.
Yeah, well, the one that I was looking at and that AE West is using is called MADE Events, MADE. But I think the theme, and I think you saw it, Anto, is it's different than regular Zoom. It has to be, because the setting is different. What you need for engagement is different. And I guess the question will be, can the tools allow you to get there, and will the people? I think in a way you have to be a little more willing to interact, right? It's easy, when you're going through a show and somebody's there and you walk, what do you do? But now you're going to have to say, yeah, I want to connect with you on video to ask you what you do. I think there's a hesitancy in people to do that. It'll be interesting next week. So I'll report on that a week after.
I think one big advantage of these virtual conferences, and I'm looking forward to this one I'm involved in, see how it comes out. But one of the big advantages is the fact that it's available. It's self-documenting. So if in fact it is being recorded as well as it is live, so then we can actually, if we've missed the conference and you recommend that I go to that conference, I can actually go to it. And again, it's because there's no travel issue involved. Another thing that's kind of interesting is now you click on a conference and it says online, and they don't tell you where it is, and you don't really care. You don't even really care what country it's in. And you basically, if you like the content. So I think we're going to see more of a rapid globalization. I thought.
And one of the things I really like about you is that space and time really doesn't matter, man. That's cool.
Yeah, the two things as always with doing virtual, real physical conferences was a time and a place. Now, one of those has been removed effectively. You just have to worry about time zones a little bit, but. So
well, actually, I think that's a huge bit, is because the time zones always were a problem, and now they're less of a problem. So when I get up, I can watch this. I can watch the same thing he watched 3 hours before or 3 hours after.
Yeah, but that's watching a recording. That's not interacting with somebody at a trade show booth, right? Or asking questions live in the conference.
Right, but I think it's
This
always the
really
stage.
cuts to the chase.
Sorry.
Sorry, Ken. I'm just suggesting this is a large issue where those who are in the service industry and also facilities operators who want to meet at an event usually pick 1 or 2 events a year to meet the vendors, get to know the people they deal with, meet new customers, share information, and also meet with clients for entertainment purposes. I'm not sure how this new digital format is going to support a lot of that effectively.
Yeah. Well, Leighton, I get that. And there's the other side of the coin where always noticed that these shows a little bit of almost an irrational exuberance. So if you're going to attend something like this, it seems to me you want to be there. So the numbers might not be as high, but the interest level may be a little heightened. Just another way to look at it.
I think the other thing is the younger generation is more used to this medium than we are. Scott Cochran's just written me a great article. I haven't had a chance to fully read it, but it's called The Death of the Control Salesman, which I think is got to be good.
So other areas of news or trend that we're seeing?
I put my trend in as, again, the tech companies. I'm always sort of covering that beat for you. And tech companies are saying they're going to strive for greater diversification after all the Black Lives Matter protests, and how do we really have real change? And they see work from home as being an important piece of that. More of what we've discussed in previous weeks, that the price of living in the places where these tech companies tend to call their homes is too expensive. And so they believe they can expand out. It was an article in Ziff Davis, and the editor did say, well, it might just be lip service, because they're saying they're going to expand in Chicago and expand in Atlanta and expand in London. But those places aren't that much less expensive than Silicon Valley and New York. They're not yet saying they're going to expand in Baltimore. Right. But work from home they see that as a super important piece. And in the scope of the article, if you read the link, it says that means we're pulling back on our real estate commitments in the downtown San Francisco and downtown New York.
Steve or Jim Lee, give them any comments up to now?
I've got.
I don't. Go ahead, Steve.
Go ahead, Jim.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
All right. Yeah, I've got some commentary for the next couple sessions, but big picture wise, nothing really hit my radar during this last week. Well, I take that back. I keep talking about the bipolar ionization technology. So over the last week, my contractor came in and made me a proposal on a product that they use. So turns out there are multiple vendors in that space now for the bipolar ionization. And so there's at least 3 now that I know of. I was doing 1, but strongly recommended by this particular contractor. He has it in his own house, and really has the evidence to support the idea that it really does kill viruses. So,
look forward to the update on that. Jim?
Yeah, we haven't seen a lot of change. Things are continuing to grow and come along nicely for us. And one of the reasons is that, and I think this is important to this discussion, is that the sales cycle of what we do, especially on the analytics side of our business, is very, very long. It's often a 5-year sales cycle. So, an interruption of 3 or 6 months is basically just not a big deal over the 5-year period. So I think that you'd have to ask me in 2 or 3 more years whether this had a big impact or not. But it hasn't had much.
Okay. Thank you.
Your business is largely recurring too, isn't it, Jim, at this point?
That's right. Exactly, Tracy.
Which is
Recurring
consistent,
flow.
Consistent with some of the newer articles that I've seen out from a lot of the investors and people who watch that kind of SaaS and recurring model, that the impact has been minimal to most.
Exactly.
So we have a guest today, Rick LeBlanc, who's here. I think many of you know Rick. Hi, Rick. Just on this segment, talking about sort of big picture trends and news, anything that comes to mind that you want to share with the group? You're muted right now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Anto. Thanks for invitation. Yeah, picking up on what Tracy said and a number of the comments, Jim and John. I'm in the private equity world now, which is quite different than being at a manufacturer like Siemens or whatever. Private investors or institutional investors are really looking, especially because of what happened during the pandemic and the recession of 8 and 9, they're really looking for recurring revenue models. So rather than sell a widget and sell it once and go find somebody else, they really like business models that are recurring revenue, so service revenue, if you like. There was also a comment about being closer to the customer. Absolutely right. If you have a contract with a customer and it's recurring revenue and your product or service is delivered as an SAS type delivery, then you've got a wonderful, resilient business model. And a good example of that is during the pandemic, we've got a portfolio company, Alberio Energy, and they're primarily a collection of controls contractors that we've acquired. They're Schneider dealers or Johnson dealers or Allerton dealers or whatever. But we've changed the business model to drive more service revenue. So a typical controls contractor has some service. At Alberio Energy, it's 50% of revenue. And that was driven by a change in philosophy. Don't go chase highly competitive new construction work because that might go away someday, which happened during the pandemic when a lot of construction sites were shut down or construction projects were delayed. But there's always existing buildings. So go sell some service to existing buildings, whether it be analytics or energy services or whatever, or procurement. And so the dip in revenue for that company over the pandemic period is 7.5%.
It's good.
Which is not true of general controls contractors or manufacturers. So the investments, like Tracy said, investors are looking for recurring models and reoccurring revenue models and the kind of technology that will allow you to deliver that without necessarily feet on the ground or boots in the building. And whether it be bipolarization delivered as an SAS model, so we're looking at all kinds of potential new business startups that fit that model. Easy to raise money for that.
Okay, so we'll get back to that's kind of the main topic of this call later on. We kind of need to move to a discussion about best practices. I think that's one of the things that sort of come out of this call as being something that's very valuable to us and also to people watching. So the idea here is really just to share the best practices that we've either done or we've seen, whether they've resulted in good things or bad things, which is a learning experience. Anybody want to chime in on this part?
Yeah, I got a quick one. I'm starting to see headlines about there being some type of certification process coming, that there'll be something you'll need to do or will be available for you to do. Mark, I think you had picked up on one of those in your news items for the week as well. And you know, just the point is, I see a trend of people talking about there being some way to certify that you're following some selected set of best practices. I think that's a new headline.
You're talking about buildings, John?
Let me see. I'll have to find that entry. Hang on. I'll do that.
So while John's doing that, any other comments on that?
Tool calculates likely coronavirus exposure rates in rooms based on a variety of data input. That's one of them. But there was another one. I think Mark had put it in his slide. Just this idea of, you know, it's a developing thought around having some type of way to confirm that you've achieved some level of best practices. And
Is
I
that
just
the
pointed
bit-
it out as a theme, right?
Is that the NIST tool you're talking about, John, or something NIST came out with, or is it a different one?
Hang on, that one that I saw was NIST, yes. Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sat in on that. I was telling some of you that got on early on the Apple Developers Conference, the keynote today. And one of the new things, one of the new features they're coming out with has to do with tracking and privacy. And they used an analogy that was a food label that gives you calories and percent of vitamin A and B. And so everyone knows what I'm talking about, the little white labels on all the food. And one of the interesting things is they sort of scrolled through their examples is the list wasn't always exactly consistent and the same. So with certain apps that tracked this or that or had different kinds of tracking on the website and where you go versus how much of their information they're gathering about you. I'm wondering if there's an equivalent sort of a thing for a building that is somewhat standardized that could, you know, now we as a group certainly have this list of best practices that we could put out there and say, look, how many of you are implementing, here's a checklist and check off the ones that you're currently doing in your building. Some sort of a standard, just informational kind of a thing to put out there. I don't know if anyone, any of the groups that you guys are talking about are working on something like that, or if it's a little bit more complicated.
Steve, you're doing that, aren't you? Along those lines?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Steve, isn't that partly what you're doing with your, you know, the questionnaire and that you're putting out to people?
Measuring specific issues.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, that's what we're doing. Yeah, exactly.
And you started very focused on cybersecurity, and you've
And then
kind of
we added in the health to actually track what symptoms are showing up.
I noticed in the chat that David Katz also, I think he might be from the WELL standard that we talked about a few weeks ago with Karen from the WELL standard.
Yeah, he's talking about the WELL he's talking about WELL, which we've talked about several times. As you said, we had Karen from WELL's.
How has the buy-in been on your product, Steve? Like, are people beating your door down to get this or not?
I wish, no, they're not. Yeah,
Okay.
we've got a couple things that are we're expecting to hear from this week, but so far it's been slow.
Do you know why? Are you getting any kind of feedback? Is it too complicated, too much, or people don't care for it?
I think people don't care. Bottom line, they're not. You know, it's interesting when you look at how each state is determining what the requirements are for any particular business. So you'll see, you know, you walk in, whether it's a restaurant or a retail outlet, there's a protocol that every state is following. And so, you know, when I go into a Home Depot, the signs on the door, you know, wear a mask. So you do. So it seems like the way the businesses are each handling it is unique to the state in which the governor and whatever his commission have decided it's going to get handled. And so trying to sell it, you know, at least for consumer type stuff, there's no need for this. For the building owners, like I said, we've got one pretty significant building owner who's taking a hard look at it right now as a tool, but they're looking at a lot of other things as well, particularly temperature measurements. And so it's not clear that they're going to go with it.
I think while things are still changing so much in the world, it's going to be hard for any standard to really take foot and kind of get popular and get critical mass. Do you guys agree with that?
Wouldn't ASHRAE be developing standards, OSHA, regulatory agencies like that would supersede any kind of state activity?
But isn't the question really, you know, ASHRAE is, of course, mechanical systems, isn't this a health thing? Is it an OSHA thing? Is it a CDC thing? I mean, is it a combination? I mean, no offense to ASHRAE, but what qualifies them to determine the right procedures for all?
Right.
Well, I mentioned OSHA as well as an agency. And there's probably others that feel like they should be weighing in as well, covering parts of the total solution, if not all of it.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge I'm seeing out there with the people that I'm talking to, right, is they're confused as to where should they be looking to, and everybody's only got part of the answer as far as what they're talking about from a compliance perspective, and it's a real challenge. Like, okay, ASHRAE will tell me some stuff, but again, is that, you know, what basis are they doing that on, you know? Or,
I think it's the lack of anything definitive, right? If I could spend money and solve this problem, people would line up to spend the money. But
Right.
it's not definitive. It's helpful. It's better. It's less likely. Ugh.
It changes, and it's changing again. You know, we got another week now here behind us, and now everyone's going back to masks everywhere. I don't know if that's the same in everybody's state, but you know, in Arizona, we've been in the news, and the governor sort of laid it off to the cities and the localities, and most of them around here now are requiring masks in public places, mandated. And I think that's pretty true nationwide. It's headed that direction again. You know, that's the big change since last week, even when we talked. So here we go again, kind of thing. Right when we were starting to look at solutions and coming out of this and thinking about what the world might look like, it feels like we're just kind of two steps forward, one back. You know, rewind here.
And the thinking is that we're not even in the second
Right.
wave. We're still in the first. So,
And some are saying now that it won't really come in waves per se. It will just be,
Right.
you know, just kind of a steady state, depending on what's enforced and not enforced, at least until there's a vaccine or something that changes the overall picture.
so Alpa, you told us, I think 2-3 weeks back about the IAQ project that you embarked on. Any updates on that? Any?
We installed one. We are going to install 7 more devices to one place, and I will be able to combine them together.
What kind of place? Commercial?
It's a commercial space, yeah, in Michigan.
Okay. That's cool. Any other sort of experiences that we want to share? Good stuff, bad stuff, learnings?
Here's a couple learnings, is since you forgot me, my friend. But anyway, one is liability waivers now being considered by corporations for their employees. I don't know if you guys have started to hear that. I have, and which I find it's obviously extremely interesting. And the other is, as Tracy alluded to, where in various states, the virus is, you know, back in the news, or I should say back in the news, still in the news, whatever, increased cases and stuff, that people, organizations who had called employees back in some way, shape, or form are now putting the brakes on those. And I think those two topics we're going to start seeing over the next 3 to 4 weeks, maybe front and center in the news.
You know, something along that line too, it may be a little bit older news that I became more aware of over the weekend, is the impact on retail is bigger and deeper than I originally thought it was when it comes to the various brands that are closing buildings and closing shop even altogether. There was, I think, an article that came out, a report that came out over the weekend that kind of summarized all of that. And there are major brands in there that are just going away altogether. And virtually every major retail brand is announcing buildings being closed or locations being shut down. So, you know, that's got to trickle through to us in our world at some point. I'm not sure economically we really fully understand the depth of this yet.
Yeah, and I think just to compound that, the other one, I'm sorry.
Yeah, John was speaking, it looked like, but he was muted.
Sorry, we're seeing, because it's been supported with action by the Fed, by extended unemployment, we're not seeing the impact yet. What will happen when we run out? 2 news items along that. One, distressed hotel deals, end of summer, beginning of fall, before they hit the market, right? And you start seeing hotels close up, right? And then another one, when will it make sense to invest in building new apartment buildings again? In other words, investors are standing by the sidelines. That will catch up. I think we're all, there's a certain thing that we think, some of this has had such an immediate effect on life. The others behind it, I hear a train coming, it's behind us. I really believe that's true.
Well, the one that I was hearing was the same, was that leases, non-renewal of leases hasn't really impacted yet, right? I mean, the companies that leases are still extending, through this year. They're still going to pay out their lease, even though they may or may not be occupied, but they're all rethinking that position. So there's a delay impact on when those lease renewals will hit the deck.
Yeah,
So-
I pulled, just real quick, I pulled up the article I think somebody was referring to. And this was as of June 10th. And the headline is more than 4,300 stores are closing in 2020 in the retail.
Closing, as in not reopening.
Yeah, closing buildings.
And I think companies like Starbucks, they came out with how many franchises they're closing across the country. And some of them are using this as a time to clean up,
Right.
It provides a smoke screen for them to do things that they wanted to do anyway. But that's certainly a bellwether.
And part of the article to build on that, Therese, is there were more than 9,300 in 2019. So this is not just because of the pandemic. It's just like an extra stake in the heart of an already troubled business model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's move to the main topic of this week, which is managed service models, SaaS models. I think, Rick, thank you for kind of just sort of laying out the rationale for it. And I think other people have basically recounted similar sort of stories about investors and other people being interested. There's been a lot of talk in the building space about recurring revenue models being really difficult to go with, and I think a few of us have had experiences with that. So one of the things that we've talked about in preparation for this is trying to sort of figure out what the barriers are for recurring revenue. The business model itself is fundamentally, everybody knows that it works because we're all doing it in our sort of consumer lives and in other aspects of business life. But what are the barriers of trying to steer the building automation world into this kind of business model?
If I want to jump in, I think one of the big ones is the business model from a channel perspective, right? How does the channel players really benefit from a SaaS PaaS model? Because it's not easily defined. If I'm selling hardware, software components, if I change that to a SaaS, then there's a inherent lag in my revenue model accordingly. If I'm selling large hardware platforms, even though I might have long sales cycles, I'm going to make decent margins of that. If I move to a SaaS model, then, that's a slow build up over time, and there's a serious dip in my revenue model. So how do the channel people make money out of the SaaS model?
So Rick was basically telling us about Albireo, who is a channel entity, right? So do you want to respond to that, to try and sort of?
Yeah, let me, since most of us are in the building automation sector directly, controls contractors or system integrators, they buy a building automation system from one vendor, they buy valves and actuators from somebody else, they buy this bits and pieces, they might buy Sky Foundry, they might buy Symmetrics. They put a system together, and that's why they're called system integrators. In the old days, they do that as a fixed price installation contract. Independent controls contractors aren't necessarily good at selling service agreements for that. In fact, some of them have the bias that, well, our stuff is flawless, it'll work forever. And the service model says, no, go and talk to the customer about things you can do to, like in the old days, you had to fiddle with your pneumatic system, you had to adjust it. Well, even electronic controllers, there's things you can do to optimize the building. And ideally, you can do that remotely. A lot of that you can do remotely. But picture this in a pandemic. In the pandemic, you had all of these buildings where you had building automation systems and you had remote access to the buildings. You can take your technicians, you can say, sit at home or sit on your boat in Vancouver, whatever you need to do, and service that building. Not only that, guess what? Now you can add to the service agreement quality of indoor air quality. You can add to the service agreement any of these aspects of cleaning the HVAC systems, UVA systems. So there's a balloon of service that was created by new demands. And guess what? Guys are sitting in their shorts. Guys and girls, guys and women are sitting in their shorts doing this remotely, a lot of it. If they go to the building to do some physical work, sure, they've got to wear a mask and they've got to have a health card and all of that kind of stuff. But the good news is the customer is very happy to have that service done post-installation. And by the way, give me any other good thing I should do in the building. So this idea of a food label, Anto, is kind of intriguing. And we could say, here's all the best practices you should do. You should comply with ASHRAE. You should comply with CDC. You should comply with, and by the way, here's a scorecard. Let's make a little label, stick it on the elevator, the lobby wall, and we will certify that, oh, here's a service we can do. We will be the ones that will verify and certify that you comply. So if your tenants want to come back to work, you can show them that you're doing all of this good stuff. And huge amount of recurring revenue. Now, is this going to be a one and done? None of us think so. When the second wave of coronavirus or bird flu number 4 comes along, we'll do it again. And this is because you have, so the question about distribution model, absolutely. Guess who has the relationship with the customer? It's not the manufacturer of whatever, the building automation, the analytics, the valves and actuators. It's not those manufacturers. It's the delivery mechanism. It's the installing contractor who has the service agreement. Not only that, some of these customers, so let's say you had a big customer like Irvine Company who has millions of square feet. They come to you and they say, wow, this is fantastic. I've got all these other buildings, but guess what? Somebody else put the building automation system in. Why don't I hire you guys to do the service like you're doing in my building where you did put all this stuff in, because I like what you do. It's a mushroom. It's an explosion of service opportunities. And first of all, forget about energy services. Nobody right now is worried about energy services. Nobody's worried about compliance with Department of Energy guidelines. Everything's about clean building, make it safe, suitable for people to come back. There's 100 things we can do, which is, by the way, here's the menu, give the customer the menu, here's 18 things you can do. And depending on how their tenants are pestering them about, is the building ready for me to return? Service all day long. The only problem is you can't get enough people. Good news. A lot of other companies laid people off. You can get a lot of people now. So in February, you couldn't hire anybody. You can hire people now.
So right at the beginning of your comment, that's really great comments. Right at the beginning, you said that people on the channel are still in this mode of selling things at the front, right? And so but you know, the benefits of recurring revenue is obviously what you just described. I guess it's a question of how do we change the channel and the distribution. Anybody has any sort of experience or any comments on that side of things? I know, Mark, that you're trying to go down this path with Linkspring. Any insights as to how we can change the channel, or do we need to go directly to the end users?
I think it's, for us, or my experience so far, it's been a combination of both. Because I think, you know, as the channel, the more sophisticated folks like an Alberio, I'll compliment them, and others in the industry, they're starting to see it. Versus, you know, are we moving away from? There was somebody quoted this when I first got into business, a guy in a truck who goes around and does his thing, I got it, let's go on to the next or whatever. And I guess too, there's so many more things available today that we did not have 5 or 6 years ago, whether it be data and analytics, other types of things that go into a building that wasn't part of the conversation. So the whole conversation has changed. And I think if you, especially with the larger multi-site end users, they are, at least what I'm seeing and what we're seeing here, is preferring to go to as a service. We actually have a fairly significant end user who approached us and said, you're our technology provider. Various integrators, contractors provide the service and install and all that. We want to go to an as-a-service model. We don't want to pay for a controller anymore. We don't want to do this. Put it all as a service. And so I think that's where it's coming from, to be perfectly honest with you. And, you know, you cover lots of things, not only the hardware, you cover the software, the updates, the cybersecurity, so forth and so on. And with that comes an SLA agreement. And just like in IT, you know, we do lots of things in and around IT. You got to have this SLA agreement. And to Rick's point, you know, oh, I started here. Oh, now I can add this. I can add that, and so forth and so on. So long-winded answer. So anyway.
So
yeah, I like it though, Mark. It's definitely where things are going. And I think we know some of those companies, like you say, Alberio. And I came up into this industry first working for an architectural engineering firm that was doing net zero energy buildings, then working a lot with Altura Associates. I saw Altura and companies, but there's very few of them that are able to. There's a gap between those specifying engineers, those AEC firms that I first familiarized myself with them. They don't really understand controls. They don't really, I think they see it more of like an annoyance or something there. They don't seem to have the right people. If you know, Intelligent Buildings has a division like this, Altura is able to do it. They're able to go in and build a service company and groom those people that are able to fill this gap that's between who's operating the building and who designed it in the first place. And I think that's what Steve is probably working towards too, is those service organizations that can fill that gap are, I think, vital at this point in time, because I think there's still a lack of understanding.
Steve, you're going to jump in?
yeah, well, for sure. I mean, our entire business model is predicated on selling service as an as-a-service model. So yeah, the software itself is what we actually make, but what's going to make it successful is if every one of the contractors offers a service around it. So in the world of cyber, there are really sort of 4 or 5 fundamental things that they could do that they could offer a service contract around. There's the server itself, managing that server in all respects. There's the network. There's the users, managing all the users. And then there's the software on the application software. So those are big 4 buckets. And what we're finding is that large percentage of the BAS industry still does not have the mentality of selling service agreements, period, let alone a cybersecurity service agreement. So we're having to educate them and give them the answer. Here's how you assess the problem, and then here's the service agreement you literally can hand to your customer, and it all broken down, cookbook approach, and basically a recipe you can follow. And that's how we're going to be successful. So if we can't turn the contractors into selling a service agreement, where they're not going to sell the software that supports it. So they have to go hand in glove. And it's interesting when you compare this to the alarm industry, access control, particularly, you buy an alarm system, you're getting a service agreement with it. It's just how it's done. The industry's been brought up that way. But that's not true of the BAS. So we have this path to march down that is very much a challenge in that regard. So it's just how it is right now. But there's the opportunity is unquestionable, because the cyber, as Rick mentioned earlier, these service things are not one and done, and particularly with cyber, the threats just continue to proliferate, manifest. So it has to be a continuous offering. You can't rest on your laurels. So it lends itself perfectly for service agreements. But yeah, sure, the BAS contractors, we've got work to do to get them comfortable in knowing how to sell and present the service agreement.
So I mean, a couple of comments on online here from Bob Bittner and Patrick Davis as well, talking about the sort of the CapEx versus OpEx sort of issue. That's sort of a big deal for buildings. And Jim Lee, I know that's kind of been your sort of thesis all along, that the building as a bond, it sort of makes it really difficult to change this. Do you want to?
It does. I think that the elephant in the room is procurement. And in this industry, we've had 100-year-old procurement process where the people that are designing buildings, funding buildings, have no connection with the operations of the buildings in the long term. And the capital sources have always been available at new construction or major renovation. And there's basically no money at all. So when Antu refers to the building as a bond, if you look at a building, as most real estate investment trusts do, just as a financial asset, the only time capital can enter that building is when it is bought or renovated or sold. Other times, there's basically any money that goes in takes away from the yield on that bond. And so there is no investment available in those areas. So now if you're a channel and you've spent your entire time building your business on chasing consulting engineers and bids and specs and new construction, you don't have often relationships. And people that are in, for instance, the electrical switchgear business are in much worse shape. At least building automation and control contractors have the ability to touch the customer for some kind of service on a recurring basis. But something like switchgear, you sell it and you're done. So companies that are in those areas are always looking for a way to get a wedge into the service business. Our own experience with this over the years is that owners don't have the financial maturity inside to move money from CapEx to OpEx. And we frequently find that our analytics sales are competing with a new roof in the building, regardless of the economics. And so the key is that what I'm really excited about in hearing here is that things are beginning to change with Rick's comments and some of the other comments on the call. Maybe there's enough other SaaS stuff in the world that people are beginning to get the idea that to really add value to your assets, that you can't just make a 100-year investment up front and then not spend another penny for the next 100 years, because the world's more dynamic. The assets have to evolve at a faster pace.
Yeah.
Sorry for the long tirade.
That's interesting, Jim. And the financial modeling notwithstanding, our company's playing in 4 or 5 verticals, and you mentioned switchgear, and it doesn't matter whether it's a traffic intersection or a piece of switchgear or a machine builder or a water wastewater site. The conversation we're having today is happening in all those verticals. So it's very interesting. So I agree, there is a momentum across verticals there.
I think the security thing is an imperative that can help us bridge that, because people know they need to spend on that. I'm sorry.
The BAS industry, I think, is growing, and what I always say, crossing the floor to the IT industry, and probably the greatest example of that is cybersecurity. And basically, I'm seeing health as a services is going to be the next big thing. And also, that becomes way more important to the client than the building owner. I'm still optimistic that the client who is used to paying a mortgage or a lease rate based on a per square foot, and everything he buys on a subscription model almost. So it's these things may be easier to sell to the actual person coming into the building, the cybersecurity model and the software as a health as a software service.
So Rick, do you have any comments on the CapEx OpEx issue that we've been talking about? How did Albireo get over that, or it didn't maybe?
Yeah, I do. And many of you know this to be true. Jim Lee makes a very good case that often if you make a proposal to an existing building, the building operator says, or the property manager says, hey, I can $30,000 for diagnostics, I can do that, or I can buy a new roof. I got to buy the new roof because it's leaking on the tenant. He's absolutely right. However, there's a different financial solution. If you go, and it helps to have a lot of private equity money, but if you go and you say to the customer, tell you what, it's $30,000 if you pay us today, don't have the money, go buy your new roof. What we'll do is we'll give you an operating lease. We'll put the equipment in at our expense. We'll put up the $30,000. You give us a 5-year service agreement, a 7-year service agreement, whatever makes sense. And we'll do your UV filters at the same time, and we'll bundle it together. Oh, guess what? Now it's $42,000 over a 7-year period, and it's only $6,000 for your operating budget. Oh, you don't like 6? You want to make it 4? We'll make it a 10-year agreement. You own it at the end. Now, if you're willing to take the risk that the owner is, and it's an operating lease, it's no different than a telephone system or a Xerox copier. They owe you the money, whether the building changes ownership or not. Guess what? That's recurring revenue. You just invested some money up front. Guess what? Put an interest rate on it and get happy with it. It's recurring revenue. Otherwise, it's like Jim Lee says, they go buy a new roof and you make no sale whatsoever.
So
this is happening day in and day out. And it's a matter of, in talk about distribution, if you're the guy with a truck, you and your buddy have 2 trucks and you're a controls contractor, you don't have the money to put up for that. So it falls on well-funded channel partners like us to do that.
Right.
We
And
talked
there's
about
those
that.
Carbon Lighthouse, Redaptive, you see them cropping up, that they came out of the same people that looked at the putting PVs on your roof. Everything you just said, Rick, that applies for your wanting to get solar energy equipped at a K-12 school. And there's certain companies that have these connections into the private equity world, and there's probably going to be more of them. And they seem to they don't understand buildings, but they understand financial engineering. And I think that there's a role for them. Yeah.
You know, there's a couple of underlying needs to have a successful recurring revenue model. You know, the financial engineering is a big part of that. another piece in our industry, we have had a version of that with service, but they're some kind of a consumable, whether it's security and having to have updates, or service because I need filters changed and routine maintenance done, or the thing that's really changing, and we talked about this the other day a little bit, but data as a consumable now, in what you can do with that data. And I think that's the piece that our industry generally doesn't grasp or understand. And we need to really educate and get the word out there on how do you do that, because we've got a lot of these things that we could wrap around that, but that might be, the push that kind of puts us over the edge here. If we can really put that into practical, everyday practice and process for our industry.
But as we were talking earlier, and I think Rick made the comment, is, all right, as a service, how about workplace as a service, energy efficiency as a service, facility maintenance as a service, data analytics as a service, and cybersecurity as a service? Start looking at the individual components and then bring them in collectively, and the value is much greater and the opportunity is much greater by being able to bring in those various as a service things that affect a building and its operations.
What about hardware as a service? I guess Rick just talked about that a little bit. We'll provide the hardware. You'll only at the end, we need a 7-year contract.
Again, that's part of the overall, the hardware, the software, the maintenance, all that stuff is all part of it. And again, you've got to have the enabling technology. You've got to have technologies in there. Then you've got the as a service that is generated from those technologies and the support of those technologies.
Mm-hmm.
And equipment.
One comment that I want to make is software as a service is a scalability game. So by meaning of that is that you have to have certain scale to make profit. And it is the companies that we are talking about here, they do a certain thing, like commissioning agents. They only do commissioning agents, and they are able to scale their business to that. And it will be, the whole industry has to understand this managed service business. So the companies who switch over to it, there will be a couple of years before they break even, because they need to keep staff 24 hours as a SaaS model. They have to have staff for programming, whatever the platform they use, they have to have experts in that. Once they're doing implementation, those personnel will get raises over time. So SaaS is very efficient when you scale to a certain extent, but it is not efficient until you reach that equilibrium. Would our companies be able to make that happen during COVID time is a question that we have to really educate the customers so that we can get that equilibrium quicker than what would be normal.
So I think that's we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I think that's probably a good time to stop to pause this until next week, because what you're really starting to talk about, Alper, and I think it's kind of how do we deliver this? How do we organize the industry so that it can be scalable, right? Because both not just from the channel, which is we talked a lot about, and the finances, but in terms of the delivery mechanisms and a whole bunch of other things. And I think that's really a sort of a good topic that we can pick up next time. So at the top of the hour, any closing comments from anybody? Rick, has this been useful from your perspective?
Yeah, very much so. Appreciate the comments from everybody. I'm thinking the food label idea, Anto, I think there's some potential there. And let me give some thought to that. I'm gonna make a prototype and test it.
Wonderful.
I'd be really interested in that, Rick.
I thought you might, Tracy.
Yep.
So
I
maybe
think this gets on, sorry, I think this gets on to our July theme of, reinvention, rebirth, renaissance, because I think we have to just think outside the box because we're touching stuff we've never touched before.
And I believe that the channel is going to be more and more receptive to these new ideas as major projects get canceled that they're used to depending on.
They have to. One of the things that I put in my slide there was an article about the acceleration that's being forced by this pandemic. And people are going to have to adjust their business models very quickly, Jim, to your point.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're at the end of our show here. So thank you for all of you to be part of this conversation, and thanks for Rick for joining us as our guest, and thanks to the attendees. Video of this will be up on YouTube at some point. Please do share it with other people that you think will benefit from this conversation. With that, thank you everybody, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See you all.